Before the dollar became the symbol of American wealth, global trade, and financial power, it was a foreign coin. In the late 18th century, a merchant could walk into a shop in the American colonies with a coin bearing the image of a distant European monarch, and that coin could be accepted as money. Not because the merchant trusted the king, not because the coin belonged to America, but because the silver inside it was trusted. That coin was the Spanish dollar, often called the Piece of Eight, and its story begins centuries before the United States existed. Long before paper dollars filled wallets, people needed something that could travel, something valuable, something difficult to counterfeit, and above all, something other people would accept. Silver became one of the most important answers. Across Europe and the Americas, silver coins circulated through enormous trading networks. But one particular silver coin would become extraordinarily influential: the Spanish dollar. It was large, it contained a substantial amount of silver, and because Spanish territories produced enormous quantities of silver, these coins traveled remarkably far. They crossed oceans, they passed through merchants' hands, they appeared in ports, marketplaces, military camps, and trading houses. And eventually, they reached the American colonies. There was just one problem. The colonies did not have a single unified currency system. British coins circulated, Spanish coins circulated, Portuguese coins circulated. Various foreign coins circulated alongside locally produced forms of money. In everyday commerce, people often cared less about how much precious metal a coin contained, and more about how much precious metal it contained. That created a fascinating monetary world. A coin could be foreign, yet still function as everyday money. And the Spanish dollar became particularly important. Its reputation was so widespread that the idea of the dollar began taking root in the English-speaking world. But then something extraordinary happened. The colonies declared independence, and suddenly the new United States had a problem. It needed money. Not merely coins, it needed a monetary system. The young nation inherited a confusing mixture of currencies and debts, and its leaders understood something important. A country that wanted to survive economically needed control over its own money. So the United States began building a currency system of its own. In 1792, the young republic established the dollar as its official monetary unit through the Coinage Act. But the name wasn't entirely new. The old Spanish dollar had helped give the new American currency something incredibly valuable: recognition. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting, because creating the dollar was only the beginning. The United States still had to determine what that dollar actually meant. How much silver? How much gold? How should coins be produced? Who should control the nation's money? And what would happen when the government needed more money than it possessed? These questions would eventually lead America through financial crises, wars, banking battles, gold discoveries, paper money experiments, and ultimately to a currency that would become the most influential money on Earth. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind the everyday things we often take for granted, you'll feel right at home here. We're on a mission to grow this community of history lovers to 1,000 subscribers this month, and your support would mean the world to us. So, if you're enjoying this journey, take a second to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the extraordinary histories behind the objects, inventions, foods, and discoveries that quietly shaped our world. Now, let's go back to where our story continues. But how did a young nation with a relatively fragile economy transform this newly created dollar into a currency capable of influencing the entire world? The answer begins with a financial battle that nearly tore the country's economic system apart. because the dollar still had something to prove. And in the decades ahead, America would discover that controlling money could be almost as important as controlling territory. The dollar had finally been created. But creating a currency wasn't the same thing as making people trust it. And almost immediately, the young United States discovered a problem that sounds surprisingly familiar. There wasn't enough money. And worse, there wasn't even agreement about what the government's role in money should be. The country was drowning in Revolutionary War debts. Different states had different financial problems. Foreign coins were still everywhere, and the new federal government had very little experience managing a national financial system. Then came the first great secret of the American dollar. The original American dollar was not designed simply to be a coin people carried in their pockets. The government defined it in terms of precious metal. The Coinage Act of 1792 specified the dollar's silver content and established a legal relationship between gold and silver. But there was a problem. The government fixed the relationship between the two metals at 15-1. The international market did not necessarily agree, and that tiny difference would have enormous consequences. American gold coins could become cheaper to export than to spend at home. So people did exactly what made economic sense. They took the gold out of the country. And American silver dollars? They often didn't circulate much either. Many were exported for international trade or simply stored as bullion. Think about that. The United States had officially created a dollar, yet some of its first dollar coins weren't even being used as everyday money. But there was another strange problem. The country desperately needed smaller coins. So, while governments debated monetary policy, ordinary people were improvising. Spanish dollars were sometimes physically divided into halves, quarters, eighths, and even sixteenths to make change. In other words, people were literally cutting money apart. And this wasn't some strange underground practice. It was a practical response to a shortage of small denomination coins. But the biggest battle wasn't happening in marketplaces. It was happening inside the new government. One side believed the country needed a powerful financial system capable of stabilizing government finances and supporting economic growth. Others feared that giving the federal government too much financial power could threaten the independence the revolution had just created. And this disagreement went far beyond arguments about coins. It was really a battle over one enormous question. Who should control American money? The government? Private banks? Individual states? Or some combination of all three? The controversy eventually helped produce America's first national bank. But here's the part that is often left out of the simple history lesson. The early American financial system was anything but settled. The dollar existed, but the system surrounding it was still being invented, and the country was about to discover something even more important. A currency doesn't become powerful simply because a government declares it official. It becomes powerful when people believe others will accept it tomorrow, next month, and years from now. That was the real challenge facing the dollar, and the next crisis would test that trust in a way the young republic had never experienced before. Because America was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing that can happen to a currency isn't having too little money, it's having too much.
I trust this bill of exchange will suffice.
The dollar now existed, the mint existed, and the young republic had begun building a financial system of its own. But there was a problem hiding underneath all of it. Trust. Because creating money was one thing, convincing people that the system behind it could survive was something else entirely. And this is where the story gets interesting. In 1791, the United States created the first Bank of the United States. It wasn't a modern central bank. It couldn't simply operate the way the Federal Reserve does today. But it was given an extraordinary role for such a young country. It could hold government funds, handle federal payments, make loans, issue banknotes, and move money between different parts of the country. And here's one of the lesser-known details. The government didn't own the whole thing. The bank began with $10 million in capitalization. Only $2 million belonged to the federal government. The remaining $8 million came from private investors, and some of those investors were foreigners. That fact made plenty of Americans uncomfortable. The country's financial independence had barely begun, yet foreign capital was already involved in its most important financial institution. But the controversy went much deeper. Some Americans believed the bank could give the new government the financial stability it desperately needed. Others saw something far more dangerous, a concentration of financial power. They worried that merchants, bankers, and wealthy creditors could gain influence over a country that was supposed to belong to ordinary citizens and farmers. And there was an even bigger constitutional question. Did the federal government even have the authority to create such a bank? That wasn't just an economic argument. It was a fight over the meaning of the new Constitution itself. Eventually, the bank opened its doors. Branches appeared in several major cities. Its notes became widely accepted. And because the bank handled federal money, its influence spread far beyond the city where it was headquartered. But something remarkable was happening behind the scenes. The bank could influence the amount of money and credit circulating through the economy. When it collected the notes of smaller state banks and demanded payment in gold or silver, those banks lost reserves. And when their reserves fell, their ability to issue additional notes could shrink. In other words, America had accidentally created something that behaved a little like a central bank before the Federal Reserve existed. But then came another problem. The government needed revenue, and one of the ways it tried to raise it was through a tax on whiskey. For many small farmers in western Pennsylvania, this wasn't simply another tax. Whiskey was one of the easiest ways to turn surplus grain into something that could be transported and sold. So the tax struck at an important part of their local economy. Resistance grew, and in 1794, the young federal government faced an armed uprising known as the Whiskey Rebellion. President Washington ultimately mobilized militia forces to suppress it. It became one of the first major tests of whether the new federal government could actually enforce its laws. But there's a fascinating connection here. The dollar story wasn't simply about coins anymore. It was becoming a story about taxes, debt, banks, government authority, and public trust. Money was becoming political. And once money becomes political, every decision about it can affect who gains power, who loses power, and who gets to decide what the nation's money is worth. The first bank would survive for 20 years, but when its charter came up for renewal in 1811, the country was still divided, and the final vote in the Senate ended in a tie. The vice president broke that tie. The bank's renewal failed by one vote. One vote. A financial institution that had once been the largest corporation in the young nation was about to disappear. And that decision would have consequences the Americans making it could hardly have imagined. Because only a few years later, the United States would find itself in another enormous financial struggle. And this time, the dollar would be caught in the middle. The dollar had survived its first great test. But now, America was about to discover something far more unsettling. Whoever controlled the nation's money could influence the nation's future. After the first bank disappeared in 1811, America soon learned why national banking had been created in the first place. The War of 1812 exposed the weakness of America's fragmented financial system. Without a national bank, the government struggled to finance the war, while state banks expanded lending and issued their own notes. The result was financial instability, and the pressure for another national bank grew. So, in 1816, Congress created the Second Bank of the United States, and this time it was enormous. It was capitalized at $35 million, a staggering amount for the young republic, and eventually operated through 25 branches across the country. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. The Second Bank wasn't simply a government institution. It was a privately owned corporation with a public role. The government deposited its money there, while private investors owned much of the bank, and that created an uncomfortable question. How much power should a private institution have over a nation's money? By the 1820s, the bank had become a powerful force in American finance. Under its president, Nicholas Biddle, it helped regulate the country's chaotic banking system by demanding that smaller banks settle their obligations in gold or silver. That forced state banks to keep enough reserves to support the notes they issued. To supporters, this was exactly what America needed. To opponents, it looked dangerously close to financial domination. Then came 1828. A new president entered the White House, Andrew Jackson. Jackson deeply distrusted the national bank. He believed it concentrated too much economic and political power in the hands of wealthy interests. And the bank's defenders had no intention of surrendering quietly. Nicholas Biddle possessed considerable political influence, while Senator Henry Clay and other powerful supporters pushed for the bank's survival. Then came the move that changed everything. In 1832, 4 years before the bank's existing charter was due to expire, Biddle sought an early renewal. Congress approved it. Jackson vetoed it. On July 10, 1832, he rejected the recharter. But Jackson's veto wasn't merely about economics. It became a political weapon. The bank war became one of the central issues of the presidential election of 1832. Jackson presented himself as the defender of ordinary Americans against concentrated financial privilege. And the strategy worked. He defeated Henry Clay and returned to office with a powerful political mandate. But Jackson wasn't finished. In 1833, he ordered the removal of federal deposits from the Second Bank. Instead, the money was distributed among selected state-chartered banks, soon nicknamed pet banks. And here comes one of the strangest secrets of the entire dollar's early history. The national bank still existed. Its charter had not yet expired, but the president had effectively stripped it of one of its most important sources of power, the federal government's money. Biddle fought back. He restricted lending, tightening credit in an attempt to create enough financial pressure to force public support for the bank. Instead, the strategy backfired. The political battle intensified. Congress even formally censured Jackson in 1834 over his handling of the deposits. Then, in 1836, the Second Bank's federal charter expired. The institution survived in another form as a Pennsylvania state-chartered bank. But America had lost its national bank. And something unexpected followed. Without a national institution regulating the banking system, state banks expanded rapidly. They issued more currency, they extended more loans, and the supply of money and credit expanded dramatically. Then, confidence collapsed. In 1837, America entered the Panic of 1837, a devastating financial crisis in which banks failed, credit contracted, and businesses and investors suffered enormous losses. And that created one of the great ironies of American monetary history. Jackson had fought the national bank because he believed concentrated financial power was dangerous. But removing that institution didn't eliminate financial instability. It created a different kind of problem. America now had no national bank at all, and it would remain without one for decades. That absence would eventually become one of the most important clues in the entire history of the dollar. Because America had learned something uncomfortable. A nation could distrust centralized banking, but it could also suffer when nobody was responsible for stabilizing the system. And the question wouldn't disappear. It would return, again and again, until almost 80 years later, another financial crisis would force America to confront it one final time. That crisis would lead to the creation of something far more powerful than the banks Jackson had destroyed: the Federal Reserve. And that is where the story of the dollar takes its next, and perhaps most surprising turn.